You know, you hang on to your capital, you get a return on it, you create jobs. Why should the state not be doing that? I think we need to think about a difference between the nation and the state. They are not the same thing. The state, for example, in the housing benefit, should perhaps own land and should perhaps own houses. Or it shouldn't own them, it should hold them in interest for the nation. And I think that's quite an important sort of differentiation to make, a separation that the state is compelled to operate and do these things in the interest of the nation. I think there's a principle, and it's quite a soft principle, but I think it's one that we should kind of hold as what the state's function should be. I mean, I think human beings can be very selfish, very brutal, angry, self-seeking, greedy, all of these things. But I think they can also be very selfless, caring, cooperative, giving. And I think the state's job should really be kind of create a society where it's easier to be that latter than it is to be the former. And I don't think that's what's happened. And we in society, I mean, we in Compass say we want the state power to operate in the interest of the good society. And I think there's two important things to think about when we're thinking about state power, and power in general, actually. Power self-concentrates, so people with power, or where power is concentrated, will try and gather more power towards them, and they will use the power that they've got to do that. The second principle is that power self-concentrates. It's a zero-sum game. That is, if the central state has more power, then we as the citizens have less. Both these things tell me that the state should both be plural and decentralisation, that we should have as many sites of power as possible within the state, or within our society, actually, it's not just about the state, so that they can check and balance each other, they can hold each other to account. And that we should decentralise, that part of the same process is that we should decentralise as much as possible. And that checks against, well, that means that our democracy functions better because there's more sites of power to hold it to account. And also that there's the tendency to self-concentrate and abuse power is overruled. Does that me finish, John?
Yeah, please.
Okay.
Thanks very much, Willie. I wonder if I could ask you, Sally, if you could take up the baton. Thank you.
Yes, I think it's really important, vitally important, that we understand what we're talking about by constitution, this foundational document that's going to have to be flexible enough and fluid enough to evolve as thinking evolves, and yet inspirational enough to resonate and be a clarion call back to principles. Who are we? So I really do think that we need to back up a bit and think first about what constitutes, amounts to, sums up Scotland. That is much more than any legal document can ever contain. Though the thing we call a constitution will express some of those values, there are grounding concepts that are beyond its ability to define. And so the question we are being asked to explore is, who are we? What grounds us? What lies in that which is beyond this written constitution? So who are we in Scotland? And it's not only who are we right now, but much more important, who do we want to become? I've got to admit, I find this question fundamental to the discussion that everybody in Civic Scotland is being called to have. And it has to be that way. Everybody has to engage with this because this is going to involve all of us, and not just us, but those who come after. A written constitution, if it's a good one, and if it is something that everybody has engaged with, it gives us a coming back to point, a rallying place, lenses to look through, maybe a crystallizing recollection before we move on in a particular direction. And so I think in that sense I would welcome it. but it's not an end in itself. And so writing a constitution before we have decided what constitutes us as a people would be, to my mind, a bit of a distraction from the core debate. I don't know if you've noticed, but the world is racing ahead as never before. It's not a bad thing. It's not a particularly good thing, but it is the reality that we find ourselves in. And so if we're to navigate the future, then we have to be clear about our priorities. What comes first? What is essential? Where's our bottom line? Now, the Church of Scotland is clear that in regards to the decision on independence, we are neutral. But in our neutrality, we cannot be passive. I'm clear that for the Church of Scotland, the only side we're on is the side of the poor. And so I hope that in the bricks of any constitution that we come up with, there needs to be a clear bias towards the poorest and the most vulnerable in our society, the people who don't have a voice anymore because it's been taken away. That has to be, I hope, our bottom line, social justice. And so this written constitution, if it's a good one and if it's engaging all of civic Scotland, this gives us an opportunity, a unique opportunity to nail those particular colors to the mast. We go back to that word constitute, sums us up. What does it amount to? So what constitutes Scotland? What constitutes Scotland is not making sure that those who have arrived get to stay, but making sure that everybody has a safe place to be, even if that means that some of us have got to move over. What constitutes Scotland is remembering that our forefathers and mothers left these shores to become economic migrants. And so we welcome those who seek to be a part of us. And I hope that we wouldn't decide to lock them up or evict them at dawn or send them back especially to places where it's just not safe for them to be. What constitutes Scotland is economic justice, I hope, I believe. So we don't allow companies to charge in excess of 4,000% APR on loans to financially vulnerable people. And we don't make loopholes that encourage tax avoidance or havens, because tax is an investment in this country and in our people. So it's a duty. I'd go so far as to say it's a privilege, and we've turned it into some sort of burden, and it can't be that. I would hope that what constitutes Scotland is ensuring a safe world, so we would not condone nuclear weapons. And we would work sincerely to reduce our carbon footprint and ensure sustainability by thinking about all that we consume in this Western evolved world. I was reminded a while back about a truth, and I don't know who said it first, but it is so true, that we don't inherit our world from our ancestors. We're just borrowing it for a little while from our children. Whatever the result of the referendum, this is a unique time of discernment. This is an opportunity, and we cannot let it pass. It's a chance to decide how we will hand this on and what we will hand on or hand back to our children. What constitutes Scotland is for the people of Scotland to decide. Bring it on.
Thank you very much, Sally. Patrick?
You want me to follow that? They say the devil has the best songs. I think we just heard that the church sings pretty well itself sometimes, and I say that as someone who's not at all religious, but perhaps I'm missing out on something. Many of the things that we've heard already this evening were somewhere in my mental note of the few minutes speech that I was going to give you, and we've heard them with compelling clarity, I think. I'm not going to try and repeat or give a pale imitation of things that have been said before. So the aspect that I'd like to touch on is about the relationship between this debate, the importance of a written constitution and a process for developing and adopting it, the relationship between that debate and the referendum itself. And I would say to anyone who has an interest in securing a yes result in that referendum, there might be a different conversation for those who have an interest in a different result. But if you have an interest in a yes result, what is needed are arguments which are nothing to do with national identity, nothing to do with flags, nothing to do with 300 years of chip-on-shoulder analysis of history, because the people who are going to make their decision about a referendum on the basis of those things have already decided. The people who we need to speak to if we want to secure a yes result are the people who are not convinced by those things, but who are not hostile to the idea of independence either. And a different set of arguments will be necessary to reach them. And I think there will be many people in that category who are unconvinced but not hostile as yet, who would be deeply concerned at the idea of voting yes and handing essentially unlimited constitutional power to today's cohort or tomorrow's cohort or 2014's cohort of politicians. The power of a government, its relationship to Parliament, to the courts, to the police, to the armed forces, to the people, its relationship between levels of government, between local, regional and national. These things need to be defined. And so does the power of the state over the private sector and the relationship to the private sector that I think Willie was talking about as well. These things need to be defined. In the introduction, John, you mentioned that I've had some involvement with LGBT issues over the past, lesbian, gay, bisexual and transgender rights, and we've come a very long way in Scotland over the last recent years and decades. We've come a very long way towards equality, and I hope in a few weeks' time we'll be celebrating the publication of a draft bill on equal marriage. But there are very many people in that community who are anxious, because at the moment we know we have a Scottish Parliament which, if it passes legislation which impinges on those rights, which undermines human rights and equality, a court can strike it down. Now, I would like to have a Parliament that's limited in that way after a yes vote as well. I would like to have the reassurance that we create an independent country which is from day one bound by some of the restrictions on political power that I think any modern democratic and secular society ought to be bound by. And if we vote yes in 2014 and haven't had that debate about how to create and how to adopt a constitution, we will end up with a step backwards away from equality and human rights. And that's before we even think about some of those other issues around intergenerational justice that I think Sally was talking about quite rightly, about how we define the economic interests of the energy revolution that we're going through. We'll still only be in the early days of that in 2014, and we need to have a debate about who owns the economic benefit. Does it all just get snapped up by a handful of multinationals, and we swap a large industrially scaled and remotely owned fossil fuel energy industry for a large industrially scaled and remotely owned renewable energy industry? We'd be missing a trick if we don't do that. And a debate about the Constitution can also get into those issues, so that we're not just looking at, for example, an oil fund, which is mentioned on the paper in front of you, but also how we ensure that government has to serve the interests of intergenerational equity and sustainability. The relationship between different parts of an emerging independent Scotland absolutely have to be up for debate. And this goes way beyond some of the simplistic arguments that we can get over into the press about the head of state, about monarchy versus an elected head of state. It's hard to get this issue of nation building into a media debate about the process we're going through over the next few years. But we're going to have to make sure that the political parties and the public, and hopefully the media will pick up on it as well, do get their hands around these issues. I'm told that the SNP's software for developing the campaign is called Nation Builder. And it may be very, very effective at getting a message honed and communicated to an audience. But unless we also engage with the actual business of building a nation, then I fear that audience will be not only concerned, but right to be concerned. And I think we may risk losing those who are at the moment unconvinced, but not hostile and open to being convinced. We risk losing them if we don't offer an honest debate about handing them power through this process, rather than simply empowering hugely whatever day's cohort of elected politicians.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Kate, I wonder if I could ask you to take things forward. Thank you.
Just before I start, while happy for everybody to know what I do in my day job at Children First, I would just like to say that I'm here in a personal capacity, and in no way, shape or form is anything I have to say to be aligned with anything that Children First might want to say on such matters. Although I think it would be fabulous actually to have somebody from the children's sector here to talk about children's rights in this process, and how a constitution could embed children's rights there. However, I also realised as well when I was asked to speak, when I looked at the list, by the time it got to me, it's highly likely that anything that I could say about a written constitution might have been said already and probably said much better. So I'd like to talk to... Oh, am I not on? Sorry. You'd think I'd know this. I come here all the time. I thought I'd talk to you about Borgen, because for any... most people I'm aware probably are aware of the programme from Denmark. It got me mulling over the importance of a written constitution to an independent Scotland. Indeed, I believe it's the vital first step to creating the kind of Scotland I'd like to live in, and I'm sure many of you do too. Just in case anyone did miss it, Borgen is a Danish political drama that relates what happens when a minority party with a very different leader, one who speaks from the heart and promises a different kind of politics, wins an election and forms a coalition government. It's the story of how the difficulties of holding that coalition together, of how the foibles of human nature create dramas and scandals, and how events and issues of governing change this idealist and corrupt her during her first year of office. And I use the word corrupt in its widest sense, because by the end of the series, she's become like all the other politicians, micromanaging, reliant on spin, blown off course by the threat of a mendacious media. She loses sight of what matters and what is important. Her family suffer the consequences and her marriage falls apart, which is not, absolutely not, to blame the woman, but to blame a political system and culture in which any sign of putting family first before duty is a weakness rather than a strength. Essentially, the Prime Minister becomes the kind of politician the system can cope with, a system that comprises vested interests, of newspapers holding sway over public opinion, of grubby little political compromises taking precedence over ideals and principles, of inbuilt intolerance and prejudice, of bullying by big business throwing its weight around to threaten the policies of a democratically elected government, of a police and intelligence service riding roughshod over people's rights, of a press prepared to destroy lives in order to gain a salacious headline, of the existence of a class over there, separate from the people, running the show with little separation between the estates, and of a government able to lean on broadcast media to break the rules, of power becoming way more important than principles and friendships, and in amongst it all, a political leader drowning and losing sight of her purpose and moral authority. It sounds horribly familiar. So, the closer we get to the referendum, and I hope to independence, it's a situation like that the more I realise how vital a written constitution is. Embedding values and principles of equality, fairness, tolerance, respect, dignity, justice, democracy, inclusion, transparency and accountability in the building blocks of an independent Scotland is key to creating a new Scotland. A written constitution is the way in which, in one step, we set out our stall to do things differently. It's how we can tackle many of the injustices inherent in our current system of governance, a system which has evolved over time with conventions and shadowy rules which only the players know, and a system and with a system that acts to reinforce those rules. It's a system which allows governance to be conducted in secret and out with the bounds of democracy and legality far too frequently. And it's a system in which entitlement, Leslie's word, is king and is jealously guarded. Now, I'm not so naive to think that all we need to do is write a halfway decent constitution and we're sorted. After all, look at Borgen. Denmark has a very fine constitution. We might want to park the constitutional monarchy aspects, or some of us might want to do, but in the whole, it's a constitution that's worth a look at when we come to frame our own. But changing the current order of things and becoming the nation we can be, that we want to be, takes cultural shift and a real effort as well as a will to change. Independence offers that kind of opportunity, and it starts by embedding in our founding document, in the architecture of our governance, the country we aspire to be. If we get our constitution right, we have a guiding lodestar in our journey to nationhood and to creating a just and fair society. So again, let's look at Borgen. Why not? Having been buffeted by events, both personal and political, the first ever female Danish Prime Minister recalibrates. She delivers a speech to open Parliament that takes her back to first principles, with her country's constitution and belief in her people and the possibilities as the touchstone, emphasising principles of common action and purpose, universality, solidarity, responsibility and unity. She reminds the Parliament that she leads what she is there to do, and them too. We are not Denmark, we are Scotland, but we too can have a future that's built firmly on strong and good values and principles if we use the right process to get to the right end in terms of a written constitution.
Thank you very much, Kate. And now, Ross, if I can ask you to finish off for the panellists.
Okay, thanks very much, John. I have the lucky task of following everybody and being able to pick parts of everybody's contribution and trying to tie it all together, actually, before we go into questions and answers. Elliot kicked off with a description of the Constitution as a fundamental law, an operating framework, if you like, a constitutional context for a parliament which Patrick was describing as one based on sound principles, for example, social justice, equality, fairness, and the like. And then Willie took up that theme, I suppose, in terms of decentralising power from Parliament out to people and to communities and giving them a stake, whether that's a physical asset stake in terms of a house or a stake, for example, in public services and public service delivery. Leslie spoke about entitlement and I suppose, although I'll forgive Leslie for mentioning councillors and police given the introduction about my background and linking them both to corruption, not me, Gov. And I suppose, in terms of talking about entitlement, Leslie was really talking about how do we better produce public engagement in all aspects of our life in this country, whether that's in the here and now in terms of the design and delivery of public services, or whether that's in shaping the Constitution and being able to ensure that everybody has an opportunity to be engaged and have that entitlement to be engaged in developing that. But it took, I think, Sally and an American why not, given the Constitution, given the quote that I'm about to use, to talk about the need for the Constitution to be flexible, to be fluid, and to be, above all, inspirational. It needs to define, if you look at those boards behind Sally and Leslie, it needs to define both what we are and, indeed, who we are. And I'd like to pick out a quote from, it was actually Anthony Hopkins playing John Quincy Adams in the film L'Amistad, where they were talking about, there was a trial in terms of whether slaves should be entitled to stay in the States or not. And he finished off a really passionate speech. If you haven't seen that movie then, and you are obviously interested in constitutional issues, then go and see it and listen to that speech. And he finished off with, "We are who we were and who we want to be." And that was the point that Sally made, is that we need to build our constitution first and foremost on what this place is about. And it's that connection between place and people, between people and place, which should be the bedrock of our constitution. If we are to create a new state, then we need to define what kind of state that is, and that is defined largely by the people who live in that state. And our defining characteristic is how we treat each other. And that's best summed up in terms of how we design, how we develop, and how we deliver public services to each other. And so the Constitution, it needs to be able to be flexible enough to be able to allow public engagement in all of those things, right through to the here and now in terms of the design, the development and the delivery of public services. So, for example, some questions which need to be asked as this debate gets underway. Why is it that we are so bad at involving the public and giving them a stake in aspects of public life? We don't allow pupils and parents to design the school curriculum, even under the framework of Curriculum for Excellence. We don't yet allow, in any meaningful sense, the public to have their say in terms of the development of public services, say through patient opinion or My Police, and being able to use that feedback to design public service from a user perspective, and therefore to shape the relationship between people in place and how we treat each other and define the kind of state in which we live. And we don't either have the ability yet for people to deliver public services themselves. The state plays far too big a role in terms of public service delivery. 54% or thereabouts of GDP is driven through the public sector. It plays far too big a role. Why can't we have people through social enterprises, through partnerships, through public entities, being able to deliver across all aspects of life? One shining example over the past 2 or 3 weeks, little Martha, can't remember Martha's second name, little Martha Payne in Argyll and Bute, has used social media and will hopefully transform not only a very important aspect of public services, school meal,